Okay, today we have an opportunity to talk to somebody who's been in contact for quite a while, but I've never chatted with him. His name is Tobias Reber. I think I only slightly butchered the English pronunciation of it. I'll let him kind of give you the full scale on the pronunciation, but he's an artist with an incredible discography. He's doing some really interesting work. He's worked with a lot of interesting people, and I did some looking, and I decided I really needed to talk to him. So with that, I introduce you to Tobias. Hey man, how's it going?
Hi, Darwin. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah, so you kind of mentioned that there's a couple of pronunciations of your name. Could you just give us like what your preferred pronunciation is?
Actually, Tobias is fine. That's what all my English-speaking friends call me. I'm Swiss, so in my dialect, it's called Tobias Reber.
Okay.
But most of my friends either call me Tobias, which is the German pronunciation, or Tobias, which is what people usually
English,
say in English. Yeah.
Right. When I look at your site, which will be in the show notes, when I look at your site, you have an incredibly long discography, both of your own projects and projects that you work with other people. So instead of trying to list those, I'm going to ask you to just kind of like tell me what you consider sort of your like your current and active work.
Well, my main artistic work at the moment is the work that I'm doing with Pulp Noir, which is a cross-media performance group working from Zurich, Switzerland. And we are currently working in the beginning stages of a new production, which will premiere in November. And that's what I've been doing for the past couple of weeks, mainly.
I mostly saw that from the videos that are on the site. It looks like an incredible production. It's multimedia in the old school way, which is like a lot of stuff on a stage with a lot of production action, right?
Yes, it's the real thing. It's literally, it's the place where we try out everything we're interested in, and we find ways to use it and incorporating. But we're also not shy to throw things out and use it in a later production. But you're right, it's very production intensive. There's video projections, there's musicians, actors involved. There's me, who is kind of the media art, live electronics, samples and Foley person in the group. And it also depends. We're also doing installations, and we have also done film remixes live on stage, where the video artist is remixing the film.
Oh, okay.
So the visual side, and the musicians and actors are recomposing and reacting the movie, or telling the movie in a different way than the movie version itself does.
That's really interesting. Now, how many people are involved in that project?
The project was founded by Thomas Fischer and Julia Morf, who are also the leaders of the project. I don't know what the right word in English would be, but the cast is actually changing. There are people who have been involved for almost every project, and then there are people who are there for just one specific role in a project. So in the current production, there's an actor, an actress, a dancer, there's me doing the sound, and then there's Julia doing the video part, and there will be 4 people on stage.
Okay.
Plus then you have the director, you have a light person, and the sound engineer.
Mm-hmm. Now, in addition to that, where I first actually ran across your work was the trio that you were doing with Marcus Reuter. That's where I actually first ran across you being part of a group. So I've always kind of been into the things that he's done, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the Centro Zun group, right?
Right. Yes.
First of all, why don't you talk a little bit about what that group is about?
Well, the group is actually much older than, I was almost going to say than I am, but that's not true. But the group has existed for 20 years, and I've been a member for close to 9 years, I would say.
Okay.
I knew about Marcus from a German guitar and bass magazine called Gitarre und Bass, where they ran an interview with him, I think around 2001 or 2. And then I went to a class he was teaching, and he became my teacher, and then we became friends, and we started working together. And then they asked me to join the group, which had been a duo at that point, but which had been a trio for a while, featuring a singer. But I'm not singing, so I just did electronics as well. And we've been working on and off. It's not a project that's continually active, but we do an album every couple of years, and we play some shows. Marcus and Bernhard have also played a duo US tour last fall, which I couldn't be part of. And so it's a very flexible thing, and we just try to get in some work here and there.
That's a really interesting group, too, because it's what you don't often see is guitarists that are comfortable working that kind of environment. And so in that, there's like two guys on laptops and one guy on guitar. How do you get like the interplay between musicians when it's that kind of instrumentation?
By listening, I would say. So it's really all improvised. We also know each other well enough that we kind of know where we all are going. And it's not, we don't usually call it free improvisation, but it's rather like a real-time composition approach, I would say, where we kind of know where we're heading with a piece. And there's, we're not afraid to use cliches or to like fall into a fixed groove and go from that and jam on that. But then there's also things that are really free and noisy and all that. So it differs from project to project, and we've also started to change our setups without telling each other, so that we're surprising each other when we play. And I would say one of the main things that's distinguishing Centrozoon from a lot of improvised electronics is that we are working heavily with harmony. So we just throw in chords and free tonal structures and create clusters that way, which sometimes are grinding against each other very heavily, and sometimes they're perfectly mellow, and we like improvising with that as well.
Well, that's kind of interesting that you say that, because that is sort of like one of the secrets of sort of the improv experimental thing, which is as long as everyone stays away from chords, you're not going to get too bad of a train wreck, right?
Yes.
But so you're kind of walking on the high wire in order to introduce harmony into the game at all.
Yes, that's actually one of the credos of the group, that we are, one of our slogans is we invented the wrong notes, which can be understood both ways, that we actually invented them, but also that we try to invent notes, but we invented the wrong ones.
Right.
So we play a lot with humor and with wordplay. We're all very interested in that because we're all speaking English a lot, but okay. the other two guys are German. I'm Swiss, so I speak German, but it's still a foreign language, even though it's similar to my mother tongue. And a lot of weird misunderstandings happen that way, and we just constantly celebrate that. And I think that's also, in the whole way that we think about what we're doing, that's in there as well.
Sure. Now, I hate to do just sort of like a list of all of your projects, but I was kind of surprised at the breadth of them. Because another thing that you do in a similar but kind of completely different vein is something called Blast Unicorn, yes. Which is another collaboration with a guitarist, right?
Yes.
In listening to it, it seems like you have maybe like an inner prog-rock person that's trying to get out.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's actually kind of where I'm coming from. I was a guitar player as a teenager, and I listened to a lot of 90s prog rock is probably what you would call that. So bands like Dream Theater and Spock's Beard and things like that.
Right.
And then I kind of moved towards jazz and free improvisation and things like that. But I've always been interested in, bands like King Crimson and projects kind of from the King Crimson orbit, which is also what Marcus and Bernhard are heavily involved in.
Right.
And so that's definitely an influence. And with Alex Dowerk, who is my collaborator in Blast Unicorn, he's more of a straight up guitar player, but he's also an improviser, and he's very much into heavy metal music and bands like Meshuggah, which I also love. So in Blast Unicorn, it's kind of the meeting of those two worlds, I would say, the freeform electronica and quirky composition stuff, and the heavy metal stuff meeting programmed drums. So it's kind of a fusion of all that, and it's obviously very playful and over the top.
And then, kind of like on the opposite side of things, is your solo work. I got a chance to listen to your Cola album, as well as it looks like it's pronounced. It's like should be collapse, but it's got that same KOLA on the front. So I don't know. Maybe you call it Cola Apps or something. But which is a bunch of remixes of the work
Mm-hmm.
from Cola, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, to me, where the Blast Unicorn stuff is really strongly on the almost like prog rock side, the Cola stuff seemed to be on, you know, not ambient per se, but kind of like the variants of ambient that has interesting percussion. It came across really as almost percussion composition, in the way that you were using timbres in that thing. And that seems like it seemed very different from all the other work that you're involved in, to me.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you mentioned ambient music, because that's actually at one point what I described it. How I described it is ambient percussion,
Uh-huh.
because to me it really has the feeling of an ambient record, but it's almost exclusively percussive sounds.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's Kola is a work that happened really quickly. I composed, or I generated the pieces within 3 evenings of working at home, and so it's easy to add conceptual baggage in hindsight, but that's actually not what it was. But so the project happened just by fiddling around with a max patch, which is kind of a step sequencer, which I've been developing over a couple of years and which I've used in various projects in one form or another. And I've also used it to trigger melodic sequences. And so I'm sending MIDI messages to synthesizers, plugins, software synthesizers. And then just one evening, I tried to use the melody generators with microtonal percussion, and that's what happened. And I started tweaking and I started recording, and I just composed about 10 pieces, I think, over 3 nights, and 7 or 8 of them made it onto the album. So it wasn't a planned thing at all. It was pretty improvised, but it was a one point in a very long process of developing that software.
So now my question is, we have this really wide array of different kinds of things that you do. Where where are you coming from that you feel comfortable in all of these areas? One of the things I like doing my podcast is talking to people about their background, but especially when somebody is able to sort of like exist in these experimental and then maybe ambient and maybe progish and all these different genres, and you seem very comfortable in all of them. What what's your background that puts you in a place to have those kind of interests and abilities?
I would say at the most basic, it's really just a love of music. I remember from a very early age on that I started noticing when I would have goosebumps when listening to music, and that's kind of been a compass of mine. And that just happened with a lot of musics. I've never really been one to define myself if I wasn't being forced to. So I listened to a lot of rock music as a teenager. I used to play Eric Clapton guitar solos on the electric guitar, but I was also interested in jazz. I was, as I said, interested in progressive rock. I really like the idea of odd meters and like the kind of epic composition approaches that these folks used. And through that, I got into classical music a bit more. And it's really just been a process of discovery, and I just find very interesting approaches and methods and aesthetics in a lot of places. So later on, I studied music and media arts in Bern, and I had a very good history of music class that I was taking for 2 years, and I discovered Renaissance music, and that kind of blew me away. And then it's just I just added more and more and more things to my palette. And it's not that I can do all of that, but I think all of that is in there. And as much as I like bands like Sun or Meshuggah or Opeth, I I listen to Burial and I listen to Renaissance vocal music all in the same day. And I think Marcus and Bernhard, who have really been very influential on me, they're kind of the same, although they're both very different musical personalities. I would say we just share that curiosity about what music is doing to us and what we are experiencing when trying out all these different approaches and the music that results from that. So I could never have imagined Cola before I composed it. And that's kind of why I'm interested in algorithmic approaches, so that I can really follow my intuition and try to formulate it in a max patch, for example, and then still surprise myself and actually create music that I think is new to me and that I like listening to myself.
That's really interesting. I like the way that you talk about all of these different kinds of musics as being influential, because I think sometimes there's this sense where people want to hear that you studied something and learned all the notes of them, or if you say you're a jazz player, that you sat down and listened to all the Charlie Christian solos and learned those, or if you're a Renaissance vocalist, that you went back to the old documents and learned all the shape singing and stuff like that,
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I like the way that you talk about this, almost that as it's a subliminal influence rather than being one that's a direct result of study. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I think so. And so I hear what you're saying in that I've always, and I still feel the problem of knowing how to do things as on one hand, being a necessity to learn, to grow,
Mm-hmm.
to master a skill. But on the other hand, if you really can play all the scales at a very fast speed, you are very likely to do so and to apply that skill. And that can be good if you're a bebop player, but it can be a problem when you're trying to find a new style. And for me, that's as I said, when I discovered Max, for example, that was such a huge shift in my thinking, and it took me a couple of years to realize that it was actually possible to not just imitate my heroes, because I never finished songs, because I always thought they sounded like a bad mix of my three favorite musicians at that time. So with Max, I started to, and I realized it sounds like a commercial, but so be it. I realized that I could actually abstract my knowledge into rules and then see how those rules play out to generate music that was actually mine in a way, that I came up with, but which actually surprised myself, and where I couldn't immediately point to the two or three major influences. I am all for studying. I loved studying music theory. I very much think that you should know the history of music if you want to find something new. But at the same time, you need to develop that confidence to listen to your intuition and then find a way to not forget all you know, which is a cliched thing to say, but to find ways to surprise yourself.
Well, the idea of using Max to develop little systems, that it's an interesting way to think of it, that what you're trying to do is sort of like embed your knowledge, but still have the system allow you to surprise yourself. Generative systems can be all over the place. They can be, you turn on a thing and music just squirts out. And on the other hand, it can be like a thing with 5,000 knobs, which allow you to adjust everything, which just makes it a very complicated instrument, right?
Mhm.
Where on that scale do you find comfort? Do you like to have lots of control, or do you have relatively few controls? Because that too then applies how much setup you have to do ahead of time on the kind of music that you're trying to create.
Mhm. It really depends on the context that I'm working in. So first, I think we should distinguish between live playing and fiddling around at home. So
Hmm.
Cola, for example, is very much a thing where I just stumbled upon something and then tweaked it until it sounded right, and then I just recorded 10 minutes of that.
Okay.
And in the patch that I'm using there, there's no chance at all. So if I've implemented the reset feature right, then it should play the same piece every time you press play. So it's just permutations and lots of filtering of notes, and
I see.
but
Okay.
it's all cycles based and rules based. There's no chance in there.
Got
But
it.
then in other projects, especially if you're playing live, I think you have that same old problem of digital electronic music, that nothing is possible unless you define it. And I like to keep my setups pretty open. So let's say I have a granulator patch. I try not to have too many restricting features on how I use it, so that I can decide in the moment how I want to play it. But then you also have to define which parameters you want to control with a external controller. So there's always, it shifts from project to project. I can't really give a definite answer.
Sure. Especially in the use of chants. Is that something that you embrace for playing live? Because especially when you're working in a collaborative thing, when you're working with two other people on stage, or, in some cases more, chants, it can be risky in a fun way, but it can also be
Hmm.
risky in a not very useful way, right?
Yes.
I mean, so how often do you find yourself allowing chants to happen in a live environment?
Well, I think as soon as you're interacting with other people, you can't avoid a certain degree of chance. But then you could say that's not really chance. That's just interactions and understandings and misunderstandings. And for example, in Centrozoom, we try to use those in a productive way. But as for the setup that I'm using, it depends. I haven't really been an improviser in the classic sense for a long time, but with Centrozoom, it's really one of the things that I really love about this group is that everything's possible, in the sense that everything's allowed. So we come up with weird things, and it might sound bad for the first 15 minutes, but then we find something that works and we record it. And even in gigs, I would say, when we play a tour, it might just sound very different from one night to another. And I don't really use chance operations like the chance object, the random objects, or anything similar things in my patches, but I like to have these kind of uncontrollable elements. It always, I think, depends on which levels of composing or playing you apply them. If you have if you apply them on a large structural level, like for example which synth sound you want to use, that's a very different thing than when you have some randomness in the note velocity that you're using.
Hmm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. What it means, though, is that what it sounds to me is that you almost develop an instrument for each sort of performance environment you have. And there's in among people who work with Max or Reactor or Super Collider and some of these systems, I tend to see two different kinds of people. One set of people defines a great instrument that they use for all of the performance environments. And sometimes that means they might exclude certain kinds of performance because it doesn't fit their instrument, right?
Hmm.
In other cases, like yourself, I think, it's almost like you design an instrument that's purpose built for each performance, whether it's a recording or a live environment. You
Hmm.
create a specific instrument for that and kind of purpose build it for that specific role. Is that
Yes,
fair?
that's absolutely correct. And I do wish sometimes that I had my instrument that I'm playing and where I develop kind of fluency like I
Yeah,
had on the guitar.
right.
But on the other hand, it's just in the way that I work, working with very different groups, it's also not even possible to just keep the same setup from project to project within one group. Say for example with Pulp Noir, it's always a combination of Ableton Live with many different controllers, sensors, microphones, varying amounts of microphones sending me signals to do various kinds of things, integrating Macs for various kinds of uses. So it's always the setup, the instrument is being built during the rehearsal phases and between rehearsals, and it's developing right until 1 week before the premiere, I would say. So for the new project, where I'm the only musician, I have to kind of take care of things that I'm not used to taking care of. And I have to find new ways of being a performer and new ways of integrating all of that in my setup, because I also have two different computers on stage, and I have various places on stage where I have to be to play because of scenic performance reasons. So I also have tablets from which I have to control things, and it's always a work in progress. And with the other groups, it's partly that as well, but also I just like to try out new things, and I don't want to confine myself to one instrument. But I also don't build my instruments in a way that would require me to be a virtuoso player of them.
That's what I was going to ask. I was going to ask if you're constantly changing instruments, how do you attain any kind of facility on them beyond the most basic thing?
Mm.
So in the creation of your instruments, do you build like functions that kind of assist you in doing things properly? Or how do you use the instrument then to facilitate a specific performance?
Well, it depends. Again, with Pulp Noir, we are always working, creating the whole piece over many months. And
Right.
I built my setup around that. And when the performance is ready to be played live, there's improvisation in the way that I may react to a dancer differently each night or to a performer. But the whole piece in itself is fixed. And at this point, I'm really playing a 90-minute composition.
Got it.
And so I have my buttons on my tablet ready to trigger the right thing at the right moment. And I think there is a kind of virtuosity in that, in, keeping all that stuff in my head and knowing when to be where.
Tell me about it. Well, it's funny that you say that because I have found that I have a really weird quirk, which is that if I have to wait to press a button until a specific time, I'll get like itchy fingers, and it's hard for me not to press the button early. There have been so many instances where I've like just like lost patience and like twitched my finger and hit the button. It's like there's almost like a virtuosity just in terms of like freaking waiting.
Yeah, that's true. That's why all these controllery things are very tempting. But then there's also the matter of interplay. You just have to find the right moment, which is what I think is a classical thing that musicians have to learn, that when is the right moment to do what you want to do. For example, on Sunday, we had a rehearsal with just the actress and me. We tried doing the bleep sound on certain words. So let's say she was
Right.
talking to herself and cursing,
Right.
and I tried to bleep out all the curses and also mute her microphone signal at the same time. And I was always early, and you just have to relax into allowing yourself to not think too much about it and just find the groove. And it took us 20 minutes until we had that. So that's one of the preparatory exercises, because I think there's going to be some live censoring of her words in the final performance.
That's
That's an
hilarious.
example. Yeah.
That sounds pretty fun.
It is.
In terms of your interface with the computer, now I've seen some video. I think it was with Centrozone that where you're using like a Behringer BCR controller. You mentioned here that with the Pulp Noir, you have tablets that you're using sort of as an interface. What are your favorite interfaces, and why do you choose them? In terms of controller tools.
Yeah. I would have to say that it's the BCF from Behringer, so the one with faders.
Okay.
And I love that just because it's so big, and I can really, it fits the hands well, I think, and it's in a way it's a bit clumsy almost, but I really like to play with that, and I've had it for almost 10 years, I'd say. And I originally bought it because I was doing a small installation where I was actually using the faders, which you can automate to trigger egg holders. So like when you have a breakfast egg and you put it
Yeah.
inside this
Yeah, egg
thing, I
cup.
had
Yeah.
egg cups. Yeah, I had 4 of those metallic ones, and I used sticks, chopsticks to play them like a xylophone.
Okay.
And so that's why I bought the BCF, but I've used it ever since. And as for the other things, I like Touch OSC on the iPad. I have a iPad 2, which is getting old by now, but I almost only use it for Touch OSC, and I build all kinds of interfaces on that. I use like PlayStation controllers. I have quite a few Nano Control fader boxes by Korg that I'm using, and it varies from project to project. Again, for this new production with Pulpmar, we're trying a lot of things, and we're trying out different kinds of sensors and accelerometers to do stuff like to trigger sounds with body movements, and it's the whole range depending on the project.
Sure. Well, now it's interesting you say that you're going to be using sensors and all that kind of stuff, because the other thing I noticed on your website is that you've done a fair number of installation works, and they all look like they're sort of sound art related installations.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really intrigued by that, and to some extent, you went outside of the typical computer tooling to do this stuff. You had to, because most people aren't doing percussion works with solenoids firing against a hard wall, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious about, like, both in terms of working with sensors and weird sonic actuators. Did you get into that at school, or is that just something that fell into your lap? Or and how do you do sound art installations? I haven't gotten a chance to talk to a lot of people that do sound art installation work, and I'm just curious how you get attention for that work.
As for the attention thing, I have no idea, and I have to admit that, as you see, my website is very old. It's still on like looking the way it did when I made it in 2011 or whatever. And most of the installations documented there were done when I was still studying music and media art, what the program is called.
Okay.
And I did try out a lot of things. So, doing a sound installation with a photosensor, photovoltaic sensors,
Okay.
and doing the percussion thing. And it was a matter of really experimenting. And I didn't really do sound installations for a couple of years until 2014, when I did a piece for the 500th anniversary of the church building in the town where I grew up.
Okay.
And but that wasn't an interactive piece. It was generative in that it was a 24-hour soundscape generated from recordings of the church bells.
Okay.
But it wasn't reacting to the audience or anything.
Right.
And I have only started using sensors again with Pulp Noir or these kinds of triggers. But even with Pulp Noir, we're not doing interactive installations.
Uh-huh.
It's something that I want to get back into, but at this point, I have no right to call myself a sound artist, I would say.
Oh, that's interesting, because some of the work is really pretty compelling looking. So it's
Thank
interesting that was done while you were in your studies. That's cool.
I would probably say that I did work pretty hard when I was studying. I really made a point of trying out everything that I could. I felt it to be a real privilege to be able to study that kind of work for 5 years, and having to pay almost nothing. I don't know if you know that university education is basically free here.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I've no idea what kind of life I would be leading right now if I had all that debt. So I think that's and I was aware of that because I had friends in other parts of the world at that time already, and I was like at every point during my studies, I was aware of the privilege that I had, not only of being accepted to study there, but just to be able to have access to all those persons. I had really fantastic teachers and mentors. at the same time, people like Marcus, who taught me a lot, kind of as a second parallel thing to the studies, to the formal studies. I was just very lucky, I guess.
Yeah, true enough. Since you are based in Switzerland, it's interesting to talk to people about what things are like. I don't think that people think of Switzerland necessarily as a center of a lot of media activity. It's not, I think when people think of like European hotspots for music and sound work and stuff, everyone thinks of like London and Berlin and
Mm-hmm.
maybe a little bit Barcelona and some of these other
Mm.
places. What do you find is unique about being in Switzerland, and what are some of the positives of having come up in that environment? And do you feel like there are any negatives of having been there?
I haven't studied abroad, so it's hard to say, but I think the quality of the education that we get here is really, really excellent. And I've benefited a lot from very good teachers at all points in my education. And Switzerland is a very rich country. The downside is that it's also a very expensive country to live in as an artist. But I think there's more ways to get funding for projects than in many European countries, I'd say, certainly than in Germany. That's one of the upsides, I guess. And yeah, the downside is really the high standards of living that we have here, which is good, but which is very expensive if you're trying to kind of lead a life that is not conforming to the usual career expectations.
Sure.
And also, if you want to invite friends from abroad to do work here, or invite artists from abroad, it's very difficult because it's so much more expensive than other countries.
Our time is just about up. It's been really great to kind of like talk about all these different aspects of your work. I'm just curious, what are you exploring for the future? What are the next things around the corner for you?
So for the rest of the year, I'm going to be working with Pulp Noir a lot. And I have a new trio that we just rehearsed for the first couple of times. And it's a trio of 3 MS-20 mini synthesizers. It's an
Good
instrument that
choice.
I discovered. Well, I knew about it for a long time, but I got the chance to buy one for basically half price last spring, and I've also been working on a solo album where the MS-20 Mini is basically it's doing 90% of the sound, and the rest is digital synthesizers and electronics. So I'm working on that album as well, and we're having a Centrozoom gig in Switzerland coming up in October, and I hope we can do some more recording around that and maybe find more gigs. And I'm working as a free agent until the end of the year, but then I also have to find some new work to support my life and my family. And so that's what I'm planning to do in the near future.
Got it. Very interesting. Well, good luck with that. I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to talk with me. I just had a lot of questions, and I feel like you really open the doors to a lot of understanding of how you do things. I'm always curious about people who are able to juggle a lot of things, and it's been really interesting to hear about how you do that. So, thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much for having me, and thanks for doing the podcast. That I got in touch as a listener primarily, and I'm very much looking forward to continue to listen.
Yeah, well, you'll get to listen to yourself now, so there's that. But I do want to thank you for that, and with that, I'll let you go on with the rest of your day. So thank you so much, and have a good one.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Okay, many thanks to Tobias for spending the time chatting with us. I love some of those perspectives. I hope you do too, and I hope that you'll come back next week. Hope you'll share this podcast with others, with your friends, and I hope that you will come back next week and enjoy the podcast more. Catch you later. Bye.